Welcome back. Here we are again with turning points in U.S. history. And in this session, we've jumped quite a bit ahead. From 1492, Columbus's voyage to America, we're jumping to 1607, Jamestown, the establishment of Jamestown, England's first permanent colony in America. Um, this is a course that moves rather rapidly, and this is a great example because we're jumping ahead a century just to explain how this colony came about. But we will give a little bit of preview of things that happened in between, or at least comparison of what England's colonies were like as opposed to Spain's or France's colonies in the Americas. Now, if you listen to the theme music, of course, then you would have seen that um, you would hear the song from Pocahontas. Maybe some of you grew up seeing that movie. I was a little too old to have seen it growing up. It was more, and I didn't have children when that movie was new, so it was more something going on while I was in college. So I honestly didn't pay much attention to it back then, but I've since paid more attention to it and definitely have some strong feelings about that movie. As much as it might um, touch on the heartstrings of a lot of people who remember that movie fondly, we must remember that that movie says more about America in the 1990s than it really tells us about Jamestown, Virginia in the early 1600s. We'll get to more of that as we go along. Our purpose here in this session is to understand what the Jamestown colony was like, how it was different from the kinds of colonies that the Spanish and the French created to begin with. And we'll look at some of the details of the early days of this colony as well. So let's begin, shall we? Um, I'll move myself here a little bit, get out of that. There we go, get out of the picture. First thing I want to do is just explain what the English colonies were like, how they were different from Spanish and French colonies. Um, this map gives us a rough estimate of the lands that each of these competing European powers would claim. But I'm mostly focused here on just how the English colonies were different from some of the others. Now, your textbook's going to tell you a lot about Spanish colonies. We don't really have time to lecture about in this course, but you will certainly see from the reading that the Spanish, after coming into the Caribbean with Columbus and others following up, they spread very rapidly in the early 1500s from going into the peninsula of Florida, and eventually, thanks to a conquistador named Coronado, I'm sorry, Cortez, I'm getting my conquistadors confused. Cortez first comes in, conquers the Aztecs, and then Coronado will search the southwest for cities of gold. Another conquistador named De Soto will come this direction looking for cities of gold. And the Spanish had claim of um, a great chunk of land, what would be today's Mexico and Central America, as well as a lot of the American Southwest and parts of South America as well. The conquistador Francisco Pizarro was the man who, with a small force, conquered the great Incas empire. Now, again, lots of interesting stories there, but we'll let the textbook take care of that. And I have highlighted a few of those individuals in the reading guide, so it still could be quizzable kinds of material, but just a little bit of that might be testable kinds of material. The main thing to remember here for this presentation is that the Spanish colonies were very hierarchical, very top-down kinds of enterprises. Um, the Spanish monarch would oversee the whole enterprise, and of course they would appoint governors or viceroys over various parts of their colony. So up here there's New Spain, down here they called Peru. The king of Spain would appoint a viceroy that oversees both of these places. And then underneath the viceroy, there's another layer of bureaucracy. It is a very hierarchical, top-down kind of enterprise, something very much directed by and involved by the monarch of Spain. Also, the church is very involved. Spain was a very proudly Catholic nation, and Spanish missionaries, um, Spanish priests would be involved in the spreading of religious doctrine here. So everywhere that the conquistadors, everywhere that those conquerors went, there were also missionaries there to establish missions and convert Indians. Now, those missionaries and the soldiers sometimes, in fact, oftentimes had conflicts with one another. One had more of a military focus, one more of a religious focus. And sometimes those two things could clash. Missionaries wanted Indians to come into the mission, be converted, learn about the Catholic faith, live as the Catholics lived, and then, um, grow food and things to sustain the mission, and follow their religious teachings. Um, the the military was more interested in conquest, though, and keeping control. But both of these are very hierarchical institutions, both the Spanish government and the church, and they're both very instrumental in establishing Spanish colonies. Okay? Spanish colonies didn't really have um, autonomous um, villages, autonomous entities that tried to rule on their own. Okay. Um, Now, this part in blue you see, this is a real exaggeration of what the French would eventually claim, but really their first settlements were just along the St. Lawrence River in Canada, or eventually spreading to the Great Lakes. Now, because they were also the first to travel the entire Mississippi River, they claim every tributary that runs into the Mississippi. That includes the Great Missouri River coming this direction, Ohio River coming from this direction. So they're claiming a whole bunch of land, basically anything between Appalachian Mountains and Rocky Mountains. But it's not that they have settlers everywhere. French colonies are very different from the Spanish. The French colonies were not as much about establishing missions where natives will come and live within and work under the priests and live within Spanish law. No, the French colonies were more of a trading post. The French didn't have the numbers in North America to really have conquered anything. So what they're trying to do is just have a trading post in places like Quebec and Montreal, inviting the Indians to come and trade with them. They need good relations with the Indians in order to profit from these trading posts. So the French do bring missionaries as well, but they tended to be more inclined to let the Indians continue many of the religious practices that they had become accustomed to. If they add Christianity to that, that would be great. But they're not as insistent that the Indians stop all of their traditional religious ways and do only what the French will allow. No, the French are better at trying to establish good relations with Native Americans, partly out of necessity. They don't have the numbers to have conquered and say, we control a great chunk of land. Another thing, keep in mind about the French, they also, were under one government. This was not broken into a bunch of different separate colonies. New France was just all of the French colony in North America. Um, and um, and they get very involved in Indian conflicts. I mean, conflicts between different Indian groups. The French bring weapons, bring guns that, of course, the Indians had no knowledge of before, And they show to the Indians that were closest to them, these guns can make the difference in your wars with enemies. So this was mainly Algonquin speaking Indian tribes like the Huron that they make allies of. And they can show these guns will make you a more powerful warrior. And thus, Algonquin speaking Indians in Canada, the great Northeast, they become close allies of the French. And the Indian Confederation that the French were mainly fighting against were the Iroquois, who we'll talk a little more about later on. So the French have definitely gotten themselves involved in Indian warfare that was already happening before they arrived. They've just made it that much more deadly because they've introduced guns. And, we could say the Dutch also get involved because the Dutch also set up trading posts in what we would now call New York. And the Dutch also introduced weapons to the Iroquois Indians. So we have French colonists on one side, Dutch colonists on the other, each siding with different parts of Indian tribes involved in their intertribal war. So again, it's not that the Europeans bring war to North America, that was already going on, but they certainly intensify it. And these tribes that had been trapping animals for their furs, beaver furs or otter furs, that had already happened. But now the French and the Dutch make that much more profitable. It encourages the Indians to trap all the beavers and otters that they can and bring all of those skins because Europeans have a taste for that fashion and they will not run out of how many of those they can sell. Okay, so I'm not really meaning to go on a tangent here. What does all this have to do with Jamestown? Well, we need to understand, first of all, the English colonies were different from either the Spanish model of their hierarchy and missions established with Indians, or the French model of trading posts and getting involved in Indian wars. The English colonies were very different because they were, at least initially, established by companies with very little involvement from the king. Now they had to have permission from the king to move into his lands, but we'll see in the English colonies, the early ones, and certainly Jamestown, Virginia qualifies, that these were company-led colonies. They're business ventures, and it has very little involvement from the king. Also, when we talk about lots of colonies, we'll see that there is a great deal of variety in the English colonies. It's not all just New Spain or New France. The colonies of England, there's great variety in the way that they are governed. So, the second point here, the legacy of English settlement, the legacy was not good. The English had attempted to establish a colony in Roanoke. They called it Virginia. Now, this map is too large to really zero in on where we're talking about. We think of the state of Virginia now as, kind of a mid-sized place. Well, the English use the name Virginia to talk about a lot more than just the state of Virginia. To them, this area here, the mid-Atlantic coast, they had been calling Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. She was never married, so she was sort of married to the kingdom. And so Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, she's the namesake for Virginia. Well, Roanoke really would be off the coast of North Carolina today, but they thought of it as all Virginia back then. So this was a failed experiment in trying to establish an English colony. In the 1580s, Sir Walter Raleigh tried to establish a colony here. He's one of the investors. And there's a number of colonists that are dropped off. And, about a year later, they're ready to go back. So there's a second attempt in the 1580s to try to establish a colony. Once again, there's about a year goes by. This time there's more delay with bringing ships to resupply the colony because England gets involved in a war. They're in a war with Spain because we've got Catholic Spain and Protestant England in conflict. The English were not as prosperous and well off as the Spanish, but some of their English ships could act as pirates and take what the Spanish were bringing back from the Americas. So Spain had finally had enough. They were going to go teach the English a lesson, and this war breaks out in 1588. Well, that meant in the meantime, the folks at Roanoke have no one to come and resupply them. By the time any English ships can make it back to North America and check on this colony, the Roanoke colony was gone. There's no one left. It wasn't really clear if they had died. There were just bodies all over the place. If they had relocated, if they had moved in with an Indian tribe. All of those were scary propositions to the English. And it was a mystery. What happened to this lost colony? Well, that mystery is why the English legacy with settlement had been very poor already. They've attempted to establish colonies a couple of times in this area. None of them have lasted very long, and no one has really survived or around to talk about the second experiment. But the English had not given up in trying to establish colonies, and a joint stock company called the London Company decides to try again. Now, a joint stock company, that just means lots of people can invest in this corporation, and it's not going to be owned by a single individual. It will be owned by all the stockholders. The London Company will decide to try to establish a colony again, once again in Virginia, as a business venture. Now, many of them are still religious people, so yes, they're going to bring religion with them, but their purpose is really business. They think this will help get the English established in North America, and this can be a money-making venture for the company. You invest in the company, and this colony does well, then the colony's prosperity will also be prosperity for the stockholders. So here we go with Jamestown, the first established settlement in this colony of Virginia. Again, Virginia was thought of as a much bigger area, but the English have already had fishermen and others exploring. They think of that as their area, but Jamestown is the first specific settlement there. So let's talk more about them specifically. Get my product placement from Jason's Deli. Good lunch. Okay, well, the Jamestown settlers, the first colonists, were a little over 100 people. They start with closer to 150, but many are going to die on the trip over or shortly after arriving. But with a little more than 100 people there, it's an interesting mix of people. They had to have a few people that can do certain jobs. You know, you have to have someone who can be a barrel maker. You need someone who's a blacksmith who can, shape metal. You did have to have someone who could perform religious ceremonies. Again, this was not the purpose of the colony, but they do bring Christianity to this colony. The minister there would be a representative of the Church of England or the Anglican Church. This is not going to be a Catholic colony. The Church of England's the official church. And colonists are required to attend those daily religious services, not just on Sundays, daily religious services. Other colonists, there are a lot of people who were second or third or fourth sons of pretty wealthy families. If you're the oldest son in those wealthy families, you would probably inherit land in your father's estate. But if you're, son number 2, 3, 4, on down the line, you're not going to inherit the land or the estate. You may be looking for some other trade, some other way to make a living. So there's a lot of colonists who actually came from pretty well off families. There aren't really enough colonists who know how to farm, how to clear the land and make something grow. That would be most useful. So these colonists are going to struggle. Something else to note about these first colonists, it's an all male group. There's no women in the first group of colonists to Jamestown. Now, that meant that these men are not really thinking of this as a permanent home for themselves. They're not coming with families. There's no prospect of finding wives, and the English really frown upon mixing with Native Americans, much more so than the Spanish or the French do. So um, these men are mainly just adventurers. They're thinking this is a way to come have an adventure, make some money, and go home, at least the very first group. Well, as I said, the death rate is terrible. Lots of people are dying, and even as they get more settlers coming in, every year or more than once a year, there'll be more ships come, drop off some more colonists. Um, most people are still dying or deciding to leave. When there's a new ship come, sometimes colonists would decide, I'm going back. And one of the leaders of the colony that tried to do something about this, tried to do something about their struggling to survive, was a man named John Smith. John Smith was an early leader of this colony, and he realized that one of the problems in the colony is that people aren't working for the good of the colony. They are just kind of out looking for gold themselves. They're on adventures. They're hoping that they can bring back the kind of riches that the Spanish have found in the New World. And John Smith, decides make it a rule among the colony that if you are not working for the good of the colony, if you're not out plowing the fields, clearing the land, it's trees everywhere in Virginia. If you're not trying to establish um, a good farm here, then you do not get to eat of the provisions that the company has brought with them. That was his rule. If the man does not work, don't let him eat. Something from the Apostle Paul, actually. This was a biblical pronouncement that John Smith says, if a man does not work, do not let him eat. Well, that does bring some order to the colony, but they're still going to struggle quite a bit. Now, the reason you probably have heard of John Smith, or if you ever saw the movie Pocahontas, the reason you would know John Smith is because of his encounter with Pocahontas. And it's depicted in this scene here. Now, John Smith was a lot of what we know about Jamestown really comes from John Smith because it's his writings. He's a primary source here, what he's written, and he describes this encounter where he and another man had gone out, kind of looking for food. They had actually found Indian places where the Indians had buried food before. John Smith dug that up and was more than happy to share that with the colony. Now, this time, he and another man went out looking for food, and when he came back, his friend was killed. He had been shot by so many arrows now, he looked like a pincushion. John Smith knew he's in danger, and he's captured by the local Indians there called the Powhatan Confederation. And he's taken before the great chief of the Powhatans. Oftentimes the English just called him Powhatan. So John Smith believed he's about to be executed, and it looks something like this scene here. He was leaned over a block, his hands are tied behind him, and he believed that this warrior is about to bring down this club on his head to smash his skull. And you can see they can sharpen one end of it too to make it a little penetrating spike to go through a skull also. He's ready to die. But he says just before the man brought this club down on his head, a young daughter of Powhatan stepped forward to save him. And this is Pocahontas. Well, we have no reason to doubt this encounter exactly, but we may question if it meant exactly what John Smith thought it meant. Now, he may have just thought Pocahontas was enamored with him. He's a very strange, exotic looking man with pale skin, and she may have jumped forward, "No, father, do not hurt him." But most historians, and certainly people who study Powhatan culture, would say that's very unlikely. It's very unlikely that a daughter of Powhatan would defy his orders, because Powhatan has many wives. He has many, many daughters. Even if she's a favorite, he has a whole bunch that look like her. There's very little chance that she would have defied her father. Most likely, she was doing exactly what he told her to do, which is, at the given moment, you step forward and save this pathetic man's life, and he will get the message that we own him. He is alive only because we've allowed him to live. He's alive only because a little girl stepped forward to save his life. But he owes his life to Powhatan and this confederation. And they can squash all of the English in their pathetic little community anytime that the Powhatans want to. That's the message of this ceremony. Now, I know that's not really the message of the Disney movie, because in that movie you get much more of a romance between Pocahontas and John Smith. And she's teaching him to paint with all the colors of the wind. She's teaching him to understand nature and live in harmony with nature. And he's learning so much from her. It's a nice idea that this native girl that's so in touch with reality and with nature around her is teaching this fair-skinned European what life's really about. But keep in mind the historical facts here. John Smith is a middle-aged man who has lived a very adventurous life in Europe. He's been involved in various religious wars of the 15 and early 1600s in Europe. He's been all over Europe. He's seen a variety of people. He's been in prison in Turkey. He's already had an adventurous life. While Pocahontas is most likely a early teenage girl, maybe even preteen. She is a child, and she certainly knows the woods there in Virginia, but that's it. She does not have this great global view of the rest of the world that John Smith would have had much more than she did. But that's Disney. We're not looking for history in a Disney movie. But the idea that there's a great romantic connection here would kind of make most of us cringe now. He's a middle-aged, he's like me. He's a man in his 40s, and this is a girl younger than my daughter. So, there's not a romantic connection. But there's certainly, this episode means that John Smith is very important in the colony. He has this connection with the natives that no one else has. And he could do some things to make that work to his advantage. Now, he does things that wow these Powhatan Indians too. They don't know anything about written language. So it's very strange to them that he can scribble things on a paper or a leaf or something. And if that gets back to the fort at Jamestown, a message will have been relayed. They have no idea about written language. He also tricks them with, they want him to hand over cannons that they have at the fort. They've heard those big guns go off and they want them for themselves. So, he can agree that, yes, you can have the cannons, but they have no means to move those kinds of cannons either. So he'll break his word there, really, because he knows they're not going to be able to move the cannons, and he has no intention of letting them have the cannons. So the winter of 1609, 1610, still a very terrible time in Jamestown. The death rate is still staggering. After the first 600 colonists had come to Jamestown, only about 60 were still there alive. That means 90% were either dead or had decided to give up and go back to England to survive. And things got so bad that one man even resorted to cannibalism. Um, this was one of the few men who had now had his wife come to join him in Jamestown. And, when she passed away, he starts feasting on the corpse. That was frowned upon in Jamestown. That was not okay. And in fact, this man would be executed because of this heinous act. People weren't even so sure. Did he wait for her to die before he started to dine? But it was a terrible, starving time. This is not a place where you would be romantically thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice to see what primitive Jamestown would have been like? It would be pretty terrible. I don't think you'd want to experience it for real. And the laws were harsh too. For several years, early Jamestown didn't really have their real governor still had not come to join them, so they had more deputy governors. One was a Thomas Dale, and Dale's laws were known for being very harsh. Again, you have to show up at those religious assemblies every day, and you have to follow certain moral laws. If you were to blaspheme, if you say something against God and the Holy Spirit, you can be killed. If you say other profane things, things we might consider curse words, well, you could get a hot iron shoved through your tongue. That's part of Dale's laws. You can make that mistake once or twice, and then it's execution. They had laws against things like homosexuality or bestiality. Now, the fact that they have laws about that means, well, that kind of stuff must have happened at some point, or at least they have knowledge of it coming from England. But they had zero tolerance for such things. Homosexuality would be a death sentence in Virginia. Sexual relations with an animal, that would be a death sentence. Dale's laws were known for being harsh. It was, military style enforcement of laws. And some would say, why would anyone leave England to come to this primitive wilderness and live under more strict conditions than they did back in England? Dale's laws don't make it a very inviting place to come to. But these were the laws of the London Company, or now with its branch now called Virginia Company. They've gotten permission from the king to come, but the king is not so directly involved in the running of this colony. Only the company leaders are. Okay, well, if any of you ever saw the sequel to Pocahontas, that was one of those that went straight to video. That was never at theaters. Disney used to do that. Make one successful movie and follow it up with a much lesser sequel, went straight to VHS video. Well, in that sequel, you see that Pocahontas really never marries John Smith. That was never a possibility. She marries a man named John Rolfe, though. And Rolfe was important besides just being the husband of Pocahontas. John Rolfe was important because he developed the first thing that's going to make money for this company. He developed a new brand, new blend of tobacco. It was not as harsh and bitter as some that grew in the West Indies. It was a little tame. I can't really talk intelligently about tobacco flavors, but John Rolfe apparently came up with a winning formula that was popular all over England and all over Europe. So Jamestown finally, after 1612, had something that could make the company money. It had been a losing prospect since 1607. But 1612, they finally have something that can make them money. And as I mentioned, John Rolfe marries Pocahontas. The way that comes about is not exactly a Disney type romance either. Pocahontas was kidnapped. She was captured by the English. Really, they didn't have to raid the village to get her. She came aboard an English ship with some other friends, looking at exotic things that the English have. And then she noticed her friends say, rowing away. The friends had been paid off to leave her, and they accepted their bribe and they left. Well, Pocahontas was then a captive of the English. It's not that they really meant her harm, but there were already English people who were captives of Powhatan. And this was kind of an insurance policy. This is a way of saying, if you hurt our people who are your captives, we can do whatever we want to Pocahontas. So while she lived among the English, she learned Christianity and she had been baptized in the Anglican Church, had a new English name. She was Rebecca. And John Rolfe, another middle aged man, took an interest in her and wanted to marry her. Now, again, this might not be today's um, description of romance between a couple. It's not that they dated and found they had shared interests and, um, anything like that. This is still a man much older than she was. At least she's not just preteen anymore. She was a young woman. And John Rolfe marries her, but that was very unusual among the English. It's much more common in the Spanish colony for some Spanish to take um, Native American women as either a wife or a concubine, at least. The French intermixed with the Indians much more. For the English, you had to explain yourself. John Rolfe had to write a letter explaining that his intentions were good, that he wants to help bring Christianity to the natives. Um, this will help save her soul. He could not explain it just that I really think she's hot. He couldn't say this is just satisfying my sexual desire because that would have been a losing prospect in an English colony. John Rolfe and Pocahontas actually traveled to England, and so Pocahontas does see um, the old world, and she sees John Smith again. He had given up on the colony. He had left the colony, and he's back in England. And now Pocahontas comes to him, sees him again. Um, Unfortunately for her and for the Powhatan tribe, she never makes it back home alive. She gets ill, and she does not survive the trip back. So the colony finally had something that makes them money. What were they going to do to try to encourage more and more people to come to Jamestown? Well, the company used women to entice more people to Jamestown. The company decided this is still a very male oriented society. We need more women going and becoming wives, and families being established in Virginia, in Jamestown. Now, they'd actually spread out beyond Jamestown. There's other little settlements being established as well, but I still refer to the whole complex as Jamestown. The company was going to pay the passage of women going over to the New World as prospective wives. Um, Again, not exactly our notion of romance, but many women will become part of the company and be transported to the New World as potential wives of these settlers. That made the prospect of living in Jamestown a little more friendly. Another new company policy would be the system of head rights. That just meant you have a right to land, to own land, if you pay your own way to Jamestown. Think of it, for every head that you bring attached to a body, every person who pays their own way to the New World, you get that much more land that can be yours. You're the owner. Now, that was enticing to a lot of English people because there was no new land in England that hadn't been settled or claimed. But here was a way for someone to become a landowner. If you come to Jamestown and you can pay your own way to get there, you're automatically a landowner. And if you bring a wife, if you bring 3 children, Well, that's that much more land that you suddenly own. And that's how you became somebody in England. If you don't own land, you're not a gentleman. You have no standing in society. But if you're a landowner, you you've arrived. You're established. That was a good policy for the company. And I'll say, even if you couldn't pay your own way to get there, there was still a way for you to end up being a landowner. You could go as an indentured servant, and that meant, the company or someone else pays your way to go, and then you belong to someone else for a period of time. You would be someone else's slave or their servant, an indentured servant, usually for a term of 7 years. And you work very hard for this person. You don't have any individual rights. You do what this person says. But at the end of 7 years, you too will become a landowner. Um, this was, it was hard being an indentured servant. I don't want to bypass that. But at the end of that 7 years period, there was some promise at the end. Um, and by the way, for women, um, if they came and they were someone's indentured servant, maybe they had just served 2 years, and maybe a man there really was attracted to them and thought, I would like to marry this girl. Well, if she's someone's indentured servant, then you would have to pay for those other 5 years somehow. You work it out with her master. If you're going to marry her, you're going to compensate that master in some way. She's not just free to marry and give up her next 5 years of service. So there were definitely troubles with indentured servanthood, but it was still a way to become a landowner eventually. And for a lot of poor people in Europe, it was worth it. The other thing that made other company policy that was enticing people to Jamestown was the establishment of a house of burgesses. Burgesses, that's just a fancy way of saying representatives. So in 1619, the company decided they would establish their own House of Representatives, House of Burgesses in Virginia. And landowners, if you owned enough land, not just any amount of land, if you owned enough land, you could um, you could be a representative, you could be a burgess and help make policy for the colony. Now, let's make sure we understand this. This does not mean they're independent of the king and of parliament. No, they're still under English law. But what this House of Burgesses did was it meant colonies or colonists can actually have a say in creating some of their own local policy. That was attractive to a lot of people. This was a step toward more democracy, more representative government, even more control of your own local area than people back in England would have had. So 1619 is important as a year that a, a step toward representative government was established in Virginia. Now, at the same time, 1619 is important in Jamestown because it's also the same year the first Africans came to the colony. Um, now, there's some debate about this among historians. Were these first Africans permanent slaves, or were they just like indentured servants? They certainly stood out because they looked different. It was easy to identify these indentured servants from any other. And it does appear that they could eventually become free and own their own land, but they did still stand out among the rest of the colonists. So it's interesting that these two things happened at the same time, that democracy established with the House of Burgesses, but something that's going to grow into permanent slavery is also established in 1619. Initially, this first group probably were indentured servants. They worked for someone for a period of 7 years, and then they were free and they could have land of their own. But between 1619 and about the 1670s, people were seeing that there's some advantages of having a permanent labor force of slavery rather than constantly having to replenish with new indentured servants. You know, a permanent slave would cost a lot more than it would cost to just bring an indentured servant to the colony. But once a slave was there and they have offspring, those offspring are born into slavery. And every generation, it just grows and grows. So slavery was just economically speaking, okay, don't misunderstand me. We're not talking about the morality of it. We're talking about the economics. Economically speaking, slavery was a much better investment long term than indentured servanthood was. Um, so it is interesting that this 1619 is the year that House of Burgesses is established. It's also the year that the first Africans will be in the colony. And decades later, there's a real line dividing the white population, whether they had land or not, and the African American population that are slaves permanently. Well, let me close this with just a little comment about Indian relations. After Pocahontas died, um, relations were poor again. They had never been great between Powhatan's people and the Virginia settlers. There had always been a sense of tension and, war really between the two people. It just wasn't all out war all the time. But when Powhatan died, his brother, Canal, became the new chief of the whole Confederation. And he was really troubled by what he was seeing. He saw in the 1620s that Virginia colony is much bigger than it used to be. It's not just 100 struggling people where 90% of them are dying. Now it was thousands of people, and they seemed to just keep bringing more and more. So Canal decided it was time for the Powhatans to try to wipe them out. So he pretends friendship. He encourages the people to move outside of those forts and um, and be friendly with the Powhatan Indians. But then on one day, at a given moment, there was a signal, and so the Powhatan Indians would start to fight and kill those that they had just been sharing a meal with a little earlier. So um, this was devastating for Jamestown, and very quickly they lose about 400 people, a big chunk of the colony. They were able to fight back and defeat Canal, but the tension was it was beyond tension. There's war now between these two people and mistrust that will not be repaired. This first big initial attack was 1622. I'm not going to hold you to all these dates, but just to give you some sense of when things are happening. 1622 was this big war by Canal. And the Virginia Company really, this really affects them because the king now decides this company can't really govern itself. The king's going to have to get involved and make this a royal colony. So, as a result of this Indian war, the king's going to take over the company and say, I will appoint a governor. You can still have your House of Burgesses and you can still, make some local law, but the governor is not going to be somebody you select. It's not going to be appointed by company leaders. It's going to be someone the king appoints. Okay, it becomes a royal colony, 1624. Well, 20 years later, Canal, a really old man by then, still hadn't given up on his dream of wiping out these Virginia colonists. So he tries again. In 1644, he launches another surprise war, again, kills about 400 colonists. But this time, by the 1640s, there's tens of thousands of settlers. The Powhatan numbers have gone steadily downhill. loss because of war or disease. And the English numbers have continued to grow and grow and grow. This time, Opichan Canal himself was killed in the war, and things had changed permanently. No longer just a struggling little colony, the English had established a permanent foothold in the mid-Atlantic at Jamestown. Well, that's all for this presentation. We will pick up on the next chapter, the next episode, very shortly.